Good evening, everyone. My name is Rogelio Garcia Contreras, and I am a clinical faculty and the director of social innovation at the Strategy, Entrepreneurship, and Venture Innovation Department of the Walton College of Business. Thanks for connecting this evening via Zoom to discuss one of the most provocative and thoughtful books of our times. To our students, faculty, and community partners, thank you for being here tonight. You are in for a very interesting and thoughtful night and conversation with Dr. Riane Eisler. On behalf of the Arkansas Global Changemakers Initiative and the Graduate Net Impact Chapter of the University of Arkansas, I want to welcome you to this edition of the Global Changemakers Book Club. The book club is an interactive and multidisciplinary event to discuss leading titles on topics related to economic and human development, sustainability, social innovation and social businesses, international development, impact investment, and other relevant economic, cultural, or political topics. The idea is to have an open discussion featuring the authors of these books, renowned experts and leaders in the field, and to foster a dialogue with our students, our faculty, and the rest of the University of Arkansas community. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Riane Eisler. I encountered the work of Dr. Eisler more than a decade ago, perhaps. Since then, I have been an advocate of her theories, an admirer of her work. I use her books in my classes, have been using them for the last few years, semester after semester. I recommend her books and tech talks to my students and to everyone I can, frankly. The originality of Dr. Eisler's work is outstanding. Her ability to think outside traditional frameworks is not only refreshing, but also courageous. She is the president of the Center for Partnership Systems, and Dr. Eisler is clearly a world-renowned speaker and government consultant. She's the author of numerous books, including The Chalice and the Blade, which is a book that is in its 56th US printing and has been translated into 26 different languages. Today, however, we are going to discuss one of the foundational works of Dr. Eisler, The Real Wealth of Nations, a title that clearly makes reference to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. There's a reason for this, a very, very, very smart title, if I may say, considering the content of the book. In this work, Dr. Eisler introduces the need to undertake a rather difficult transition, going from a system of domination and exploitation into what she calls a system of partnerships and collaborations. So Dr. Eisler will provide context on her work for a few minutes, and this will be followed by a conversation with questions and answers moderated by Madison Holden, who is the president of the Graduate Net Impact Chapter, and graduate Fulbright scholar, Olga Khokhryakova. With that said, Dr. Eisler, it is an honor to welcome you to the University of Arkansas. Thanks for accepting our invitation to have this conversation with our students and our faculty. It's an honor that you're here. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It is for me really a pleasure and an honor too to be with all of you. I think that especially to be in a program for, well, global change, for global transformation, which is really what my work has been about, what my research, my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, historical research has been about, trying to answer specifically the question of transformation from what to what. And that has required, as Dr. Garcia Contreras so well explained, really stepping out of the conventional frame, out of conventional social categories like right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, which one of my colleagues actually has called weapons of mass distraction. Why? Because they fragment our consciousness. And this conversation that we are today having about economics, primarily about capitalism versus socialism or vice versa, is a very good example of that. Because as the COVID pandemic demonstrated, of course, we need both government policies and markets. But the issue is what kinds of policies and what kinds of markets. And in the real wealth of nations, and I just want to give you a little context here. I just want to say that, yes, I do question, the book was just translated and abridged and updated into German, where they called it The Ignored Fundamentals of Economics. Because if you really think about both capitalism and socialism, which came out of, well, the 1700s and 1800s, very early industrial times, and we're now very much into the 21st century post-industrial knowledge age. So on that count alone, they would be antiquated. But the problem goes much deeper. And both these systems challenged what I call economics of domination, domination economics, whether it's a Chinese emperor or an Arab sheikh or the mercantilism that Smith challenged, or later the so-called, well, it was really the early industrialism, which was so, I mean, child labor. It was a really modeled on a domination system. They perpetuated, even though they challenged much of this, they perpetuated a very strange economic map, one that ignores the three life-sustaining sectors of the economy: the natural economy, the volunteer economy of the community, and the household economy. And if you really think about this, they also came out of times, of course, that oriented more to what I call the domination end of the domination partnership social scale. And one of the cornerstones of domination system is precisely what these two mainstream economic theories ignored. Nature, for both Smith and Marx, was there just to be exploited. Nothing about caring for our natural life support systems in either theory. And as for caring for people, starting at birth, which in our post-industrial era neuroscience shows is fundamental to this high quality human capital, right? That everybody keeps talking about. It really hinges on the quality of care and education children receive in the first years. For them, this was work to be performed for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. So it's invisible. And this really gives you sort of a context, or a beginning of a context of why is now the time that we really have to rethink not only economics, but our values and our structures, because economics, and I'll end on this note and talk with you, because economics really, like families, like religion, like education, don't just spring up out of nowhere, they are embedded in the larger culture. And yes, what this work shows, as those of you who have read The Real Wealth of Nations or other books of mine, largely depends on the degree that these institutions orient to either the partnership or domination side of the social scale. And with this, whether they give visibility and value to the work of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems, both of which I would submit to you to answer the question of why now, are urgent as perhaps never before in our age of climate change, of COVID-19, of increasing inequalities. Well, you know the drill. So with that, I open it up to all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Eisler. Thank you for this introduction. And our first question is for those who would say that there is human nature and special economic interest that will always be in the way of this transition from partnership, from domination to partnership. So what you would say for those people who would mention human nature and economic interest?
And I love that question, and I love the fact that you made it the first one. Why? My most recent book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2019, really shows again and again, drawing from findings from both biological and social science, and especially from findings from neuroscience, that we have actually been told a false story about human nature. And that is fundamental. And if we really believe all of this stuff, whether it's original sin, right, or selfish genes, which is really the same story, isn't it? We're bad, so we have to be rigidly controlled from the top, right? I mean, that's the message. They fight each other, but it is the same message. What we know from neuroscience, well, I'll just shortcut here because I want to get to all of your questions. For example, studies of the brain show that the pleasure centers of our brains actually light up more when we share and care than when we win and dominate. Not only that, so I mean, really, we are more primed for caring and for sharing, but we also have very flexible brains. I mean, in fact, we know from neuroscience that the architecture of our brains is really laid in the first 5 years or so in interaction with our environment. And if our environments, our families, our economics, our communities, our belief systems, etc., orient to the domination system of top-down rankings, man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, we actually adapt. So it is not coincidental, for example, and I will stop here in just a moment, that some of the most, in fact, the most repressive and regressive and violent regimes of modern times, whether it was Hitler's Germany, Stalin's former Soviet Union, Khomeini's Iran, the Taliban, ISIS, etc. And yes, even in the United States, a certain so-called fundamentalist, which is not religious fundamentalism, but it's domination fundamentalism, have placed enormous emphasis on either maintaining or imposing what they like to call a traditional family, which is a code for a authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family, where children first learn that it's very painful to question orders, no matter how unjust. And they also learn a model of our species where the male form is considered superior over the female form. It really could be the other way around, by the way, but it never has been. But what do they learn? They learn to equate difference with in-groups and out-groups, with dominating or being dominated, with, yes, with being served or serving. And they can have a template then for all in-group versus out-group thinking, which is, of course, fundamental to our economic systems as they have stood. So it really affects our values. So I keep saying I'm gonna stop, and I really am.
Oh, thank you, that's amazing. We actually have a question about these domination relationships from Mark, and we invite Mark to pose the question by himself.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time. For those who won't easily acknowledge dominator relationships like the ones you describe in your book, specifically male-to-female relationships and its connection to caring and caregiving and economic structures, how do you initiate productive conversations to promote a common understanding, especially when people are so polarized like right now?
Well, I'm so glad that you asked that. And there, I think, depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to men, you are in a better position to do that than I am, because we have learned to privilege the male voice, right? But what I have learned is that the human rights argument goes so far and no further, that you really have to start with where people are. So this is why we have been developing a social wealth index, new economic metrics that actually demonstrate to people who control the resources, okay? The economic value of the work of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. And I think that this is a very important point that you bring up, Mark, because I think you really have to start with where people are at. And we are seeing movement towards partnership, towards a caring economics. You know, when the Real Wealth of Nations was first published in 2007, putting caring and economics in the same sentence, it was like, what are you doing? And today it's become a mainstream term, hasn't it? Yes, it's been somewhat co-opted to only equate it with the care economy, whereas we're really talking about all policies and practices being informed by the so-called soft, feminine, caring values. But helping people connect the dots is another way that I think, I mean, because when we humans really yearn for caring connection, and that's true of men as well as women. So why would we have really a system that makes these connections so difficult? I think that's a question to ask. And it developed in the course of history, because I should add that for some people, it's very important for them to know that it wasn't always so. And, you know, the chalice and the blade, sacred pleasure, really detail how, and now nurturing our humanity, which I invited the anthropologist Douglas Fry to be co-author of, because he is one of the world's experts on foraging societies, which is how we lived for millions of years, not just the 5,000 or 10,000 years of domination history. Really, a lot of what's happening in our time is deeply rooted in very ancient traditions of societies, not ideal, not perfect, even some of the early agrarian societies, like Çatalhöyük, 10,000 years, no signs of destruction, 1,000 years, excuse me, of no signs of destruction through warfare. As the anthropologist who excavated Çatalhöyük, Ian Harder, most recently said with some amazement that there was really no difference in status between women and men. Think about that for a moment. I mean, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, it is partnership. And we have ancient roots. So I'm so glad you asked this. Thank you, and I hope that you will be able to use this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Eisler. And as you mentioned at the beginning, social wealth economic indicators. So we also wanted to elaborate you on this a little bit more. We have a lot of problems developing social businesses and social innovation strategies in terms of how do we measure social impact. So could you tell us more, how did you came up with these indicators and why it's so important to have this correct set of variables to measure real impact of the wealth of nations? And also we had a kind of similar question from the audience about social wealth index, how during this time of heightened awareness of the impact of caring work on families and communities, how we can move forward with this index now?
I'm so glad that you want to focus on that question because, well, let's start with GDP, which I think you're all familiar with. It's the most widely used index of so-called economic health. The problem, GDP actually includes as productive work, on the plus side, activities that harm our health, making cigarettes, selling cigarettes, fast foods that are unhealthy, and the resulting medical and funeral costs are all on the plus side of GDP. An old stand of trees doesn't make it into GDP until it's dead, until it's been chopped down, until it's been killed. So, but GDP not only puts negatives in as positives, but it fails to give any value whatsoever to the work of caring for people, starting at birth in households and in volunteer community, or caring for our natural life support systems. Even though we today have studies such as a fairly recent one from Australia, showing that if the care work performed in households were counted, it would constitute no less than 50%, 50% of the reported GDP. And I should add that their methodology is very important there because they not only are used to evaluate the economic value of this work, its market value, which of course, since we have this devaluation of care work, is low, right? Poverty wages in the market. Economists talk about parents who stay at home as economically unproductive. Think about that for a moment. I mean, they work from dawn to dusk, but they are, in the current economic thinking, economically unproductive. So why did we develop? Obviously, there are a lot of metrics now being developed because, it's no secret anymore that it's a joke to say that GDP measures economic health. It doesn't, period. But the social wealth index that we're working on now, as well as the social wealth indicators that we launched in 2014 with funding from the Kellogg Foundation, by the way, was really designed for our post-industrial era. Remember what I said in my prior answer to start with where people are at, right? Showing the economic, and what they do is they show the economic, they're divided into two, the social wealth economic indicators are divided into two, there are 24 indicators, which is obviously too many, okay? That's why we're working on updating, condensing into an index. But they're divided into two bundles. One is human capacity development, you know, this high quality human capital we hear about so much. And the other one is care investment. And yes, matters like racial equity, gender equity, they're all part of this. But they not only show the need for this and the cost of not investing in caring for people and nature, they actually show the economic return from investing in caring for people and nature. And what we are now doing, and it's not easy, but we have a team of wonderful economists working to update and condense into an index. And some people don't like indexes, but we need them because we have to provide policymakers with the missing information they need for sound allocation of resources. So I'll pause now. I think I've pretty much answered your question. And if you have follow-ups, please ask. And I would like all of you, by the way, to really help change the conversation about not only the metrics that we need, that we've got these bizarre metrics, but also about what kind of economic system, and with it, system of values and other institutions, because as I said, they're all interconnected.
I'd actually like to go ahead and invite Gershagon to ask her question that she put in the chat. Gershagon, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Madison. Hi, Dr. Eisler. It's wonderful to meet you here virtually.
Thank you.
Yeah, you've actually already covered some aspects of my question, but I guess I'll frame the entire question again. So are there any countries that are already following this partnership type economic model? And if not, how long do you think it will take us to integrate the value of caring and caregiving into traditional and mainstream economic policies and systems? And have you actually already seen some progress, or what level of progress from the time when you actually first wrote your book?
Well, that's quite a question, and I'll start with the ending of it, if I may. The fact that President Biden is talking about investing in what he calls the caring economy, which, as I said, is really the care economy, shows that there has been, from what do you mean putting caring and care and economics in the same sentence, to actually having some understanding that this is a vital part of what makes an economy, a society, healthy or unhealthy. As for nations, in the Real Wealth of Nations, I talk, and that's updated in Nurturing Our Humanity, because Doug actually lived in Finland. In other words, some of the Northern European nations have moved the closest to the partnership side. At the beginning of the 20th century, these nations were so poor, there were famines. Whole states, Minnesota, right, was populated by people fleeing. Today, they are invariably not only in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports, but the global happiness reports. And that's very strange for a nation where there's so much darkness, These are nations where you'd think I mean, they wouldn't be happy at all because there's not sunlight, right? But they are. And a major reason for this is that they invested in their human infrastructure and in their natural infrastructure, caring policies, very generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. You know, fathers, I mean, they too inherited, you know, the values of devaluing women and the feminine. So fathers, when they first introduced paid parental leave, didn't take it. So they changed it very cleverly, which we have to learn from, that if in a family of both a woman and a man, or two caregivers, if one doesn't take it, nobody gets it. Okay, believe me, it's gone up. But they also have universal health care. They pioneered some of these policies, elder care with dignity. And you know that they take much better care of their natural environment for the most part. Now, this did not happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen because they're socialists. They have very, very healthy market economies, precisely because of what I just said. They invested in their human infrastructure. But, and it's not because they're relatively small and homogeneous. You know, lots of homogeneous societies do not invest in caring for their people or nature. It is because they moved more closely to the partnership side. And I will close with that because there are three components of partnership versus domination systems that I want to emphasize. One is that instead of, as in domination systems, having an authoritarian structure, top down, in both the family and the state or tribe, they have more democracy and equality. Secondly, yes, that fundamental difference in our species, which again, the movement towards gender fluidity is part of the movement towards partnership, by the way, although it too is being co-opted in some ways, but we won't go into that. They really, in both the family and the state and other institutions in between, have more gender equity, so much so that women are 40 to 50% of the national legislatures, and women heads of states are not a big deal. You know, they just have been there and are. And third, and these are all interconnected, they have been in the forefront of leaving behind traditions of domination and fear and violence. Why do we need them in domination systems? Because how else are you going to maintain these rigid rankings of man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion versus religion, all this in-group versus out-group ranking? So they started the first peace studies. Think about that. But they also pioneered the first laws. And this is fundamental. Prohibiting, saying it's against the law to use physical discipline against children. And you can see where that is fundamental to domination systems, because what do children learn? It's fine, it's normal, it's even moral to use violence to impose your will on others. So we're talking about rather simple in one way, but a little bit more nuanced in another. Yes, their economics are more oriented towards the caring economics of partnerism. And we see trends in this direction worldwide, as I said, President Biden. But we haven't had the frame. And without it, we're all over the map. Whereas the people pushing us back invariably focus on childhood and gender, on economics, and on story and language, which are four cornerstones that we have to pay particular attention to. And I know this was a long response, but you asked for it.
Yeah, that was a very good, well-rounded response. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love the comment you made about the sun, because being from Russia, from Moscow specifically, I just had a conversation with my friends who were so upset that in Arkansas we have almost like 2 weeks without the sun. And I said, you know, in Moscow, the average days with the sun in a year is 60. Wow. So I would guess that in northern countries like Sweden, I think even less. So, and I think it's important. So yeah, thank you for mentioning this as well.
Yeah, well, and yet they are invariably in the highest ranks of the global happiness reports. I mean, but it stands to reason, because they don't have these huge gaps between haves and have-nots. They have less, I mean, the whole movement away from violence, away from abuse, towards gender partnership, towards and it's not, you know, they invest more, by the way, proportionately in caring, in NGOs that care for people at the other end of the globe. You know, it isn't because they're related. It's because they, as they sometimes say, they have a caring society. And that's what we need.
So you talked earlier about humanity being predispositioned to caring over domination. And yet, you know, you've also proposed this concept of caring economics as a foundation for a new partnership system. But if we consider things like ancient mythology, literary traditions, as well as, you know, this predisposition in our own neural networks, caring for each other has kind of been our foundation for success. When and maybe why do you think that shift took place?
Well, there are many theories, as you probably know, about the shift. Some people put it at the feet of greater complexity, others the invention of agriculture. The two are related. But a theory that I have used in my books, in The Chalice and the Blade and Sacred Pleasure. By the way, Sacred Pleasure, the subtitle is Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body. Yeah, the body remembers. I mean, that's a very important part of the equation. But it was proposed by an archaeologist by the name of Maria Gimbutas. And at first, it was really opposed, especially by an archaeologist called Colin Renfrew. But in about 2 years ago, DNA studies came out, really verifying her theory. And even Renfrew, you know, said, hey, you know, let's re-examine this. And that theory is that it was brought into, and she studied, as I did too, being of European descent and Western, and because most archaeological excavations have been in the, so around the Mediterranean, you know, the West, it seems to have been brought in our prehistory, long before we had all of these epics, you know, the Greeks and the Bible and, you know, the whole 9 yards, idealizing really male dominance, authoritarianism, violence, etc., by Indo-European hordes that Gimbutas called the Kurgans, because their graves were so different from the earlier European inhabitants. For example, the first so-called, she calls them Suti graves, because they're the first graves with a large male skeleton, and then sacrificed women and children and horses. So I think whatever it was, it happened, okay? And there we are. And if you look at history, as I did in The Chalice and the Blade and Sacred Pleasure and in other works, you see that there have been partnership resurgences all through recorded or nomination-oriented history. I mean, Jesus, he preached partnership values, so-called soft feminine values, didn't he, of caring, of nonviolence, of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But in the course of history, we also acquired this overlay of other values. And the last 300 years, I don't want to take the time to go, but if you look at them, every single progressive social movement has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. But we haven't really paid enough attention to the foundations, and that's where these 4 cornerstones come in. Childhood, the neuroscience, it points to how we must. Gender, well, this is fundamental in our species. Economics, but a very different economics, caring economics of partnerism, and language and story, because our language, linguistic psychologists tell us, channels our thinking, so that it's even difficult without having the words, the concepts, to even imagine other alternatives.
Those are some really great perspectives. For the next question, we had a bunch of questions about it before, and I've noticed we got one in the chat as well. A bunch of people seem intrigued by the ideas of progressive tax policies. And Peter even mentioned how the somewhat recent millionaires tax in California seems to have had some good effects. Could you share some more about your views on tax policies and how they might aid in solving some aspects of inequality?
But look, taxation, banks, money, they're all economic inventions. And the real question is, do they help maintain or impose domination economics or partnership economics? So yes, I think that a progressive tax structure is important. But again, I think we need to move beyond the notion that a progressive tax structure is socialist. It is really a question, I mean, in Nurturing Our Humanity, there are studies showing that when there is extreme inequality, people on top, never mind the people, on bottom, but people on top are more insecure. It makes sense, doesn't it? So we're talking about really re-examining what works for everyone. It's up to you, and I really want to say this, use this frame and do your innovative work. Support the innovative work of the Social Wealth Index. Change the conversation. This is so important. I mean, people say, well, it's just a change in consciousness, but action flows from consciousness. And as we change things, our consciousness also changes. We see that it's possible to make changes. So you are the ones who really I'm counting on.
Gotcha. One other question that we got before the event by someone that's not actually able to attend, unfortunately. What are businesses' social responsibilities now? Have they changed due to COVID-19? And what changes or adjustments in the business sector might we see in the future in terms of social responsibility?
Well, this is huge, isn't it? Because corporations, for example, they are really created by charters. And we can change the charters, can't we? So yes, the so-called conscious capitalism movement, people cling to the old, to the familiar. That's very understandable. There are comfort zones, but we have to really think beyond 1700 and 1800-year-old theories. I mean, they're outdated, if nothing else. So I think definitely we are seeing trends towards partnership. And it is very important for us to do what you are doing in your program, to explore new possibilities.
Sounds good. Olga, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted first to ask maybe about women empowerment. You're also kind of mentioned in the book. So can you talk about the values you aim to empower? So what is women empowerment and how not to make this maybe like this, you know, from patriarchy to matriarchy, how to keep this balance?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to disentangle from the whole gender conversation the notion that it's women against men or men against women. What we're really talking about are domination gender stereotypes. And these stereotypes, well, today we hear about a thing called toxic masculinity, right? I mean, that was the ideal for masculinity, for goodness sakes. And it still is for people who are really brainwashed to think that we only have two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated, that there is no partnership alternative. It's our job to show them that not only is there such an alternative, but it is more humane, more effective, better. Finished. So the thing that my work has, I think, contributed to that conversation the most is twofold. One, to unpack the gendered system of values that we have inherited in the course of domination history, so that somehow there's always enough money for the so-called masculine, right? Prisons, you know, that's the stereotype of the punitive male head of household, isn't it? You know, I'm going to punish you. Or weapons and wars, you know, all the epics you were talking about, Madison, you know, that we've all honestly, we come by them honestly. I mean, they're part of our, quote, education, right? But that gendered system of values has made it so that somehow there is never enough money for caring for people, for the soft, the feminine, for childcare, for health care, for paid parental leave, all policies that we're, as we are trying to move towards the partnership side, we are finally hearing more and more about. The other contribution, I think, is to show that this differentiation that is basic domination, socialization of both men and women, that assigns one bundle of characteristics to the so-called superior male and only gives him emotions like contempt and anger, right? Because he does get some emotions in that system, but somehow he's a sissy, he's a wimp, and women will call him that. If he is caring, if he is sensitive. Well, a lot of men are violating that. Of course, they're feeding babies, they're diapering babies, women's work. But we need the frame. That this is not random. This is all connected to these four cornerstones. So I hope that answers. I'm trying to make my answers shorter because I want more questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Sam, do you want to ask your question by yourself?
Sure, I don't mind asking. I was curious what partnership, how developing countries and developing economies might follow a partnership style economics model, because I don't see a lot of that in the developing countries that I have visited. Yes. Granted, I haven't done a research paper on them, but just from personal experience in those countries, they don't seem to be following this. They seem to be following more of the domination style economics.
Absolutely. Well, I think that this is very, very important for the so-called developing world, because in our post-industrial era, to have more prosperity, you really do need to give value to the so-called women's work, right? Of caring for people, starting in childhood, of early education, etc. I think there are people, see, the thing is this, we are so used to thinking of the South versus the North, or the North versus the South, or the East versus the West. And actually, the struggle for our future is within all of these systems between domination and partnership. And I think it's very hard in some areas of the developing world where, for example, girls are genitally mutilated, where girls are fed less than boys, are given less health care than boys. You know, I mean, it's deeply embedded and it's justified by so-called religious and spiritual teachings. So I'm not saying that this is going to be easy, but once people get it, and that is the challenge again, where do we start? There is a global women's movement now, which is really part of the change, the empowerment of women. But you can have women who take on, as I said, you know, the whole value system, because women are just as in, look, higher education is really a problem, because what are we taught? I mean, if you really think about it, the historian of science, David Noble, wrote a book called A World Without Women. And he pointed out that Western science came out of a clerical, all-male, misogynist, celibate culture about 600-700 years ago. And it was not only a world without women, it was a world without children. And so what happens, it isn't until 50 years ago that we have gender studies. Now that's, or women's studies, and then men's studies, and then gender studies, and then queer studies, but they're still marginalized. I would think that an entry point is to ensure that people, quote, educated people in the developing world become aware of what they've been taught and how crazy it really is for everybody. I mean, but that's again, Sam, where I think that I'm counting on all of you to be innovative. Once you have this frame, apply it. Figure out trial and error. And yes, there will be failures. Of course there will be, but we'll learn from them, won't we?
Thank you. That's amazing. And time flies with a good conversation and a deep conversation. So our last question, I think we have one question we have time for would be about the Center for Partnership Studies. So can you please talk about the work you are doing in the Center for Partnership Studies? How you have managed, and how you have managed to implement many of the recommendations we discussed.
Well, we are working on it. It is the organization was incorporated really in 1987. And what happened is that the response to the Chalice and the Blade was so big that we didn't know what to do with all of these people. And so it's gone through a lot of, I suggest you go to the website, which is centerforpartnership.org. We're in the process of really formally, we're changing our name to Center for Partnership Systems from Center for Partnership Studies, because it really reflects what we're about. Yes, we do research. Yes, we do have, by the way, a journal, and I invite all of you to really look at the journal and submit to it. It's the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies at the University of Minnesota. It's online, peer-reviewed, free, you know, and I hope you will. So that's been, education has been very much our focus, but also developing tools to help accelerate the shift. So courses, online courses. There's one course that will be available in a somewhat new on-demand form, has 4 videos, and it's called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives. The videos are of me, and I invite you all to use it. Use it in your classes, use it with your friends, use it for yourself. So we've had courses, the metrics are a very important tool. I mean, because you have to look, what are the interventions that can really get us to more quickly accelerate this? Because if you look at history, it's really the movement towards partnership countered by enormous resistance and periodic regressions. You know, whether it was Hitler or Stalin or Khomeini or Taliban or whatever. You know, they can be religious, they can be secular. So I invite you to go look at our history, which is really interesting. I mean, ranging from the first international conference on partnership on the island of Crete, hosted by the former First Lady of Greece, Margarita Papandreou, to a book we helped scholars at the Chinese Academy of Social Science put together, called The Chalice and the Blade in Chinese Culture. Fast forward, you know, to caring economics. It's followed to a large extent the course of my work. And my first books were sort of trying to understand, what the hell is this? What happened? You know? And then practical applications. I wrote a book on education, Tomorrow's Children, a kind of a self-help book, which I really highly recommend. It's very timely still, and all my books are timely still. The Power of Partnership. Then, of course, The Real Wealth of Nations. With one of my former PhD students, I wrote a book applying this frame to healthcare, especially to nursing and to this whole interdisciplinary team that we see emerging, to be sure that it follows a partnership rather than a top-down again structure, all the way to nurturing our humanity. So a lot of resources that you can use.
Thank you. We have put the link to the center in our chat, so everyone can use it and follow the link. And I would invite Dr. Garcia Contreras for final remarks as we are finishing our event.
Can I just say one more thing? We're launching a movement to make partnerism mainstream. And there is a separate website sort of in development, partnerism.org. And I invite all of you to really be part of this, because that's how social movements are built.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, your questions. And thank you, Dr. Eisler, for your wisdom and for your decision to challenge the status quo and inviting us to think critically about these issues. Fostering a new consciousness that triggers action, and how action shapes our consciousness, and the ability to create a virtuous cycle in the process that moves us away from this unsustainable path in which we somehow got ourselves into. So we appreciate that you, through these fundamental ideas of the interaction that we have with each other and the values that we cherish can actually transform bigger, broader things, starting with us and the immediate relationships that we establish with each other. So thank you so much, Dr. Eisler, for this wonderful conversation and for entertaining the questions and curiosity of our students, which is what all this is about, our students and the future of this conversation really, as you mentioned, will fall on them. So thank you, everyone, for being part of this.
And thank you for inviting me and for doing what you're doing. I love it. And I've really, really enjoyed being with you. And I hope you can send me the chat because I couldn't read the chat while I was talking and listening. But I'd love to look at it. If you want to send it to me, I would appreciate that.
Absolutely, we'll do that.
And sure. I look forward to everything wonderful that you're all going to be doing with this.
Thank you so much for inspiration, and everything you're saying and writing is very eye-opening. Thank you.
My pleasure. And all the best to all of you. And we can perhaps continue this conversation in some other form at some later time, once I see some of the ways that you are applying this kind of new thinking, really, which is really rooted, as I said, deeply rooted in our more partnership-oriented past.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch, Dr. Eisler, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
For everyone still here, we wanted to give everyone a chance to interact with all of our web pages here. We have a web page for the Net Impact chapter, the Arkansas Global Changemaker chapter, or not chapter, organization, as well as the Center for Partnership Studies. I also wanted to let you all know that our next event, Net Impact and Global Changemaker event, will be March 19th from 12 to 1 p.m. Central. For anyone that would like to attend, information will be sent in the email after following up this event specifically. And if anybody would like to get more involved in the Graduate Net Impact chapter or in the Undergraduate Net Impact chapter here at the University of Arkansas, please send a message in the chat and I'll be sure to reach out to you specifically about more information.